So good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this exciting event on recent research on effective teaching and learning and how to translate this research to practice. I'd like to extend a warm welcome and thanks to our speakers. We very much look forward to hearing from you. Before we dive in, just a few logistical notes. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of the event. Please submit your questions to us via the chat box. You can also keep an eye out in the chat for links to relevant resources. This session is being recorded and the recording will be sent out after the event. With that, let me welcome you again. This event is the second in the World Bank's ongoing series this month, supporting teachers to accelerate learning recovery. You can find additional information about upcoming events in this series in the chat. Last week, to kick off the series, the World Bank launched the COACH program. COACH is the World Bank's new program to improve teacher professional development. The COACH program began with recognition of the need to support teachers based on evidence. We know what approaches to teacher performance development can be effective, but too often professional development programs and systems are not designed with the evidence of what works. Even when they are, programs may not be implemented in ways that reflect the evidence. The COACH program seeks to help countries bridge these gaps between research and practice and between design and implementation to build effective teacher professional development programs and systems. The importance of finding effective tools to improve learning outcomes in developing countries cannot be overstated. We know from research in the US and more recently in developing countries that teachers vary widely in their effectiveness, even teachers teaching observationally equivalent children in the same school. In my own research on Ecuador, for example, my co-authors and I used a multi-year experiment in which teachers and children were randomly assigned to classrooms to estimate the magnitude of teacher impact on child achievement. These impacts are sizable, and research on the United States has shown that the quality of teachers can have long-lasting effects, including on college attendance and labor market outcomes. And yet, this research from developed and developing countries also points to the fact that identifying characteristics of teachers that consistently predict learning and other outcomes is very challenging. It is in this context that I am particularly pleased to chair this session, in which experts from different fields, including economics, education, cognitive science, and educational psychology, will give us concrete evidence on what they have found works in terms of improving teaching and promoting learning. In bringing these four speakers and four different perspectives together, we hope to highlight the ways in which different fields can learn from one another and work together to help design interventions to support teachers and raise learning outcomes. Let me close this introduction by underlining the importance of focusing on effective solutions to address the dramatic crisis that faces developing and of course also developed countries. We do not yet have high quality comprehensive data for a wide range of countries, but everything indicates that the pandemic is a truly unprecedented shock to the accumulation of human capital, especially for children from poor households. We need all the insights we can get, insights that are based on high quality research, but which can be translated into programs that can be implemented quickly and at scale to address the current crisis. Unless we meet this challenge, we run the risk of losing an entire generation of learners with the consequences that this will have for productivity and equity for decades to come. With that, I am thrilled to introduce our first speaker, Alex Abel. He is an assistant professor of economics and education at Teachers College at Columbia University. His research focuses on how children form beliefs about their own ability and how this affects their human capital development. He also works to identify, evaluate, and study the scalability of potentially high leverage policy options to raise learning levels in the developing world. Professor Abel, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to be here. I've been a huge fan of the bank's work for as long as I've been aware of it, and it is a great professional privilege to be able to share some of my own work about these crucial topics. I am dealing with some connectivity challenges, and so I'm going to share my screen via a different account. I can assure you that both accounts are me. And here we are. So I'm delighted to tell you about a series of projects that I've done with co-authors, primarily in West Africa, studying bundled interventions to both support teachers and to improve learning. These two studies took place in the Gambia and Guinea-Bissau. They were published in the Journal of Development Economics and the Journal of Public Economics, respectively. And the co-authors on that work are listed in those papers, but they are too numerous for me to mention today. The motivation for this talk is the stark fact that Dr. Shady pointed out, that over the last 50 years, despite the fact that there have been tremendous gains in basic learning levels in developing countries on average, there remain stark discrepancies in the education levels between areas within developing countries. And in particular, there are these pockets of extreme poverty in many developing countries where today someone will be born and they will grow up in 2050 or 2075 to lack the ability to read a simple passage with comprehension or to conduct a basic arithmetic task. And as the world moves towards a preponderance of jobs that rely on these skills and that rely on skills that build on these skills, the importance of addressing this issue is tremendous in terms of both human welfare, but also in terms of inequality, because the people who in 50 years don't have these skills will be at the absolute leftmost of the world distribution, not only of educational outcomes, but also economic and health outcomes. So many people, including many on this call, including myself, have worked to try to understand how we might deal with this. But most work to date has tried to address constraints, sort of a one at a time, one-off approach. On the supply side, people have looked at things like the inputs that we use for schools, like textbooks or computers or classrooms, the incentives or the compensation that teachers face. On the demand side, looking at beliefs, perhaps the importance of credit markets or cultural pressures in generating high or low levels of learning. And in this paper, we're going to take a slightly different tack, or in these two papers, we're going to take a slightly different tack. And in particular, we're going to try to understand if we are trying to raise low learning levels in these pockets of poverty, just how much learning can we achieve if we combine multiple things known to work in isolation. The implementation of this study is going to take place again in Gambia and Guinea-Bissau, evaluating these supply-driven interventions. And the prongs that we're going to combine in these interventions are in Gambia, para teachers delivering after-school classes. And in Guinea-Bissau, schools run entirely in lieu of the government as opposed to after government school. And in both cases, we're going to use scripted lessons so that teachers know every day and in every increment of time what they can be doing in a way that empowers them to teach as effectively as possible, but also very much in line with the coach initiative at the bank, frequent monitoring with an emphasis on improving teacher practice and maximizing the likelihood of student learning. So the goal of the work primarily is to test the hypothesis that perhaps the upper bound on what intervention-driven learning might achieve. And the motivation for this comes from the fact that many of these previous interventions had raised learning levels, but only by 1.1 or 0.2 or 0.3 standard deviations. And as Lant Pritchett and many other people have pointed out, it would take a lot of those small increments to get us to a place where the majority of people in these pockets of extreme poverty might be able to achieve either literacy or numeracy or both. And so we want to know, if we combine things that are known to work in isolation, just how much currency can we have in addressing this problem? We're going to focus on skills and tasks that are crucial to subsequent learning, but also can be taught by untrained teachers and hopefully standardized across contexts. Right? As you go up the chain of difficulty of skills, it gets more difficult to do this. So we're going to focus really on the most fundamental skills. Finally, as I said earlier, we're going to target these very hard to serve areas. We want to briefly acknowledge the importance of previous work, both our thoughts, but also our career trajectories were inspired by the hundreds of randomized evaluations that have been done, including by many in this room, including Dr. Shady, including many of the others of you here, and the wonderful meta-analyses that have systematized this work and brought it together and helped us understand just what we know and what we don't about how to raise learning levels in these areas. There have also been a series of great papers on para-teachers, training people who were previously untrained as teachers to work in these areas and to raise learning levels. And finally, we were really inspired by a couple recent papers that show how you can bundle together interventions to target particularly tricky problems, such as extreme poverty or indeed learning, and achieve much higher gains than you might have were there other, were you sort of assessing these components one by one? We chose to work in the Gambia and Guinea-Bissau. They're small, low-income West African countries. In Gambia, education levels are very low. The majority of the population is unable to read, and more than 2/5 of people have never been to school. The primary income sources are tourism, agriculture, and remittances, which makes any investment in education come at a very dear opportunity cost. Guinea-Bissau, I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say, is in an even worse state. It's often considered a fail state because there's so many coups d'etat, there's regular political violence to sort of challenge who is running the country, and there's very little service provision outside of the capital. In both cases, we're going to run cluster randomized controlled trials with clusters of geographically contiguous villages as the randomization unit. We're going to focus on children as they are about to enter school in rural areas, again, where education levels are very low, even lower than national averages. And our primary outcome, which I'll tell you more about in a second, is each child's composite score on early grade reading and math tests. It's important to note that we don't have baseline tests because early field work made it very clear that baseline levels of learning in both contexts were essentially 0. Let's talk briefly about the intervention in each case. So in the Gambia, as I said earlier, we have para-teachers, which are untrained teachers, people who previously haven't been trained as teachers, who ran after-school classes. They were hired either from the village in which they worked or nearby. They passed an aptitude exam, and we trained them very carefully. We trained them at the outset. We trained them for a few weeks every year and sort of the curriculum for the next year, as well as gave them regular in-service training. The curriculum comprised scripted lessons, again, so teachers knew at each stage of the day what they ought to be teaching, and they could rely on this, hopefully, to teach at a very high level of fidelity. Finally, a crucial part of these interventions was monitoring. So in the Gambia, every 2 to 4 weeks, a teacher was visited by a monitor, and the monitor sat with them in class, observed them, gave them real-time feedback, and if necessary, actually taught the class themselves for a bit to illustrate what correct practice was. The focus of this was not policing. We weren't trying to see, okay, is the teacher in class? Are they doing the right thing? But much more, are we able to empower this teacher to do as much as they can to raise student learning levels? In Guinea-Bissau, we had a very similar approach. Instead of para-teachers, we had regular teachers because government service position was so low, but the curriculum also comprised scripted lessons with accompanying materials. And again, monitoring was a key component of this. And this really, we think, dovetails very nicely with what the COACH initiative is trying to do. The primary outcome for both studies was children's composite test score. We had EGRA and EGMA tests. These are early grade reading assessment and early grade math assessment tests. These are sort of gold standard tests for measuring learning when learning levels are particularly low. So there's no floor effects. They're very sensitive. And they're able to pick up even if a child learns, for example, to recognize numbers, but perhaps isn't able to add. These tools are really good for measuring learning in precisely these contexts. And it's also important to note that in many contexts, they're the tools used by the government themselves to evaluate teachers. This is very much incentive aligned. Finally, we administered these tests at a very high level of quality control. I was involved in the supervision of both, and we believe that the results that have come from these tests are highly reliable. All right, let's show you some results. So what we show here is for the Gambia at N-line, that's 3 years after the intervention started, the distribution of test scores, the sort of arithmetic mean of the percent of scores, questions answered correctly on EGRA and the percent of questions answered correctly on EGMA for the control group in the blue and the intervention group in the red. The message we want you to take out of this is that not only does the control group look like they are sort of a leftward shift of the intervention group, but indeed the two distributions are almost disjoint. And the control group demonstrates a level of performance consistent with most children not getting even half the questions correct. And the intervention group demonstrates a level of performance consistent with the. We can also break this up by different skills. So in the reading test and in the math test, we tested several different types of skills, including basic skills like naming a letter in the case of reading, as well as more advanced skills. 5A and 5B are reading comprehension questions. And looking at the distribution of performance across skill levels, you see that the interventions raised children's ability across this spectrum of skill. And in particular, what we see is that the higher level skills, so 5A and 5B being the hardest skills on these tests, we see that the control group gets 6% or less of questions right, and the intervention group gets roughly 50% or more of questions right. For math, we have a similar sort of gradient of difficulty, starting with recognizing numbers, moving on to two-digit addition and subtraction with carrying and borrowing respectively. And we see again, a very similar distribution where in the control group, after this most simple of tasks, fewer than 20% of questions are answered correctly on average, whereas in the intervention group, 50% or more answered correctly. Because we have a time constraint, I'm not going to be able to show this for you for Guinea-Bissau, but I want to show the distribution of overall test performance in Guinea-Bissau to show you that the difference is even more stark. So these were schools that were run in lieu of the government. The study lasted for an extra year. So instead of 3 years in the Gambia, in Guinea-Bissau, things lasted for 4 years. And so at the end of 4 years, the Guinea-Bissau children displayed an even higher level of performance on these tests, consistent with a very high likelihood of reaching literacy or numeracy. And the control group very rarely scored more than 20% or answered more than 20% of questions correctly, with just very, very low likelihood of achieving either literacy or numeracy, using sort of gold standard measures of literacy and numeracy based on these tests and piloted in other places. So the main result that we think that comes out of this is that when you bundle interventions together, operate them at a very high level of fidelity, and fund them adequately, you can get transformative learning gains. And the reason that we think these learning gains were so large are, one, the strengths of our intervention. We think that monitoring and coaching indeed was crucial to our success, but also using scripted lesson plans to sort of help teachers do the work that they're out there to do, as well as providing enough resources to allow the teachers to do what they do, to pay the monitors to get there, to get the right materials into these classrooms was crucial. We also think that we're able to achieve these gains because we start from a very, very low baseline. And indeed, as we found, when we got up to higher level skills, it was even more difficult to achieve gains. So one of the reasons we stopped at the 3rd grade was we weren't confident that we could get similar gains at the 4th grade or higher. So to speak to the sort of core of today's meeting, how can we translate this research into action? We think that the key message to come out of our research is proof of concept. You can achieve much larger gains, even in these hard to serve areas, than previously thought possible. And we think that the main message to take away from this is that we ought to think bigger. We also think that this emphasizes the importance of the supply side in very poor contexts. And other research, a few of us show that the demand side influences in these areas aren't enough to generate very meaningful learning gains at all. But then when combined with the supply side boost that comes from these interventions, the demand side can have a large impact on learning gains. So the crucial issue is what happens next? So as Dr. Shady said, cost and logistics are crucial. And I want to highlight the work of Ben Piper and Joe DiStefano and others at RTI, who through the Primer and Tusome initiatives in Kenya are starting to do this work. But another crucial future work we think needs to sort of focus on these dimensions. Finally, we think pulling out lessons from these pieces of research for existing systems is equally crucial. And we're starting to do this in our own work, but it's very much a work in progress. So with that, I will wrap, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A and the other talks. Thank you all very much.
Thanks so much, Alex. That was great. So we're now going to turn to our second speaker, Daniel Willingham. Daniel is professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. His research formerly focused on the brain basis of learning and memory, and today, all of his research examines the application of cognitive psychology to K through 16 education. He writes the Ask the Cognitive Scientist column for American Educator magazine and is the author of Why Don't Students Like School? When Can You Trust the Experts? Raising Kids Who Read, and The Reading Mind. Dr. Willingham, thanks very much for being here, and we very much look forward to hearing from you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good day to everyone. Thanks very much for giving me some of your time. So my talk today is going to be about the relationship of science and education, and start with the consideration of that very broadly. Scientists are interested in how things are similar and how things are different. So generally, we're looking for broad laws that will summarize a lot of what we see in nature, but we're also interested, so that's the similarity part. But then we're also interested in differences. We want to know what the boundaries of those laws are. And of course, we're also very interested in times where it seems like the laws ought to apply, but we find that they don't. Now, the same thing is true when we think about children in the context of education. People like me who study how children think, how memory works, how they solve problems, and so on. We're interested in how kids differ, but then we're also interested in ways that kids are the same. When I think about these two sort of categories of ways that science might apply, educators seem mostly to be interested in differences. And I think that's because when you're a teacher and you're in your classroom and things are working well, and then there's a few kids for whom what you're doing isn't working very well. And so you think, okay, this is mostly going great, but then there's something different about these children. How can I reach these children? And that brings this focus on differences. Now, the truth is, scientists are interested in how kids differ in their thinking processes, but we haven't been really successful in coming up with a lot of ideas that have been very useful to educators. So, for example, we know that what children know when they first come into a classroom before the lesson begins is enormously important to the success of the lesson. We know that what kids are interested in plays a big role in how they're going to deploy attention, whether or not they're going to pay attention to the lesson. We know that kids vary in their abilities. Now, the reason I say none of this is very interesting is teachers already know all this, and it doesn't give them a way forward. And when they've got those differences that are affecting performance in the classroom, it doesn't really tell them what they ought to do about it. The one idea that scientists proposed that seemed like it had some real promise was the idea of different learning styles. But scientists quickly figured out, these were first proposed in the 1950s, and they pretty quickly figured out that this was a good idea or fun idea or promising idea that just didn't turn out to be right. There was no evidence supporting it. Ironically, that's the idea that has sort of stuck around in education. And ever since the 1950s, scientists have periodically been trying to make sure that people know what the scientific evidence really is concerning learning styles. I think we have much more, many more interesting findings on the other side of this diagram in thinking about how kids are the same. Scientists actually know quite a lot about how kids learn, how and when they pay attention, how kids solve problems, how kids can gain expertise. And I know it sounds a little funny to think of like treating all kids as the same, but there is a lot of consistency in the way the brain works across humans, just as everyone's got a circulatory system with some differences, but it still works basically on the same basic principles. Same with the digestive system, and the same, it turns out, is true of the brain. There's a lot of commonalities among the brain, and the things that scientists know can really be used to leverage good instruction in classrooms. So I want to give you one brief example of that regarding this process, how kids become experts, how kids gain expertise. Now, when you first think about it, how to become an expert does not seem very complicated. What you do is you do whatever it is you want to get good at, you do it a whole lot and you're going to improve, right? So adding lots of practice seems like a non-complicated way of ensuring that kids are going to gain expertise in whatever skill you want them to be good at. But that turns out not quite to be true. When you think about it, there are certain tasks that you do repeatedly. In my case, driving a car, that's actually me in the car there. I've been driving for close to 40 years. I think for about the last 39 years, my driving hasn't really improved. The same is true of typing. I've been typing for a very long time, and I've got lots and lots of experience typing, but I haven't really improved. And this points to a very crucial difference between experience and practice. Doing something is not the same as practicing it. And this is based on the work of Anders Ericsson. And he's listed a series of features that practice needs to have in order for the person practicing to really improve and gain expertise. So the first of these principles is you really need to be doing one thing at a time. When you think about a student in school, so now we'll shift to thinking about how these principles might apply to gaining expertise in school. When you think about a student who wants to improve their writing, gain expertise in writing, you can't just say like, okay, you're just going to practice writing. You need to focus on one thing at a time because writing is too complicated to practice all of it simultaneously. So the student might practice for a while on varying their sentence structure, and then they might practice on selecting vivid words and so on. The second principle is you need to sequence these different components intelligently. So if there are multiple things that you need to practice, you need to think about the order in which you're going to practice them. It could be, in fact, it's likely that some of them are more foundational than others. Some of these features of the skill to be gained really depend on having other aspects of the skill in place. In the context of schooling, knowledge generally builds on knowledge. This is most obvious in mathematics, where you've got foundational skills. You need to know number facts, and then you start building up from there. But it's really true across the entire curriculum. It's true in science, it's true in history. And this is something that we need to pay attention to when we're thinking about gaining expertise. The third factor is getting useful feedback. It becomes very difficult to improve in the absence of feedback. Now consider someone learning how to play piano. When they play the music and it doesn't sound the way they expect, that is feedback. You understand, like, that didn't go the way I wanted it to go. But that doesn't mean you necessarily know what you did to produce that outcome that's unsatisfactory. So one thing you might do is record yourself. Sometimes when we're gaining skills, we like to videotape ourselves so that we can sort of see what we did. Sometimes it's hard to both monitor what you're doing and actually do it at the same time. So this sort of separates those two tasks. But even when you're videotaping, you may not really know what it is that you're doing wrong. You may not be able to spot it exactly because you lack expertise. And this is where coaching becomes important. Have a more knowledgeable person who is available to provide that crucial feedback that everybody needs. Fourth, you need to be able to generate new strategies. It's not enough to just recognize I did something wrong and I know what it is I did wrong. You need to be able to think of a new way to do it. And sometimes you can do that on your own, but not always. So a student who is recognizes that she's not preparing for exams in the proper way needs to figure out a better way to prepare for exams. A student who knows that the projects that they're doing in their science class tend to be disorganized, knows that they need to organize, and they need to generate strategies about how to do a better job with organization. And the final principle of practice that Erickson points out is it takes a while. It takes a long time to gain real expertise in truly complicated skills. You may have heard the 10,000 hour rule. This was actually coined not by the original researcher, but by Malcolm Gladwell, who was a popularizer of it. And there are actually some problems with the 10,000 hour rule. But I've got some photos up here to illustrate just a small fraction of the various domains in which expertise has been studying, athletics and music, and then actually car sales was one of them. There are a lot of sort of offbeat skills that have been examined. But in all of these very varied domains, expertise takes a long time to acquire, and you should not be thinking in terms of weeks or months. You should really be thinking in terms of years to gain true expertise in a complex skill. All right, so this is what it takes to become an expert. I want to point out this is not only appropriate when we're thinking about students gaining expertise, it's also appropriate when we're thinking about teachers gaining expertise in teaching. And this is, of course, very relevant to the work that Coach is undertaking. So let's think briefly about how each of these principles apply to the training of teachers so that they can gain expertise. The idea that teaching is complicated and therefore you probably need to work on one aspect of it at a time certainly makes intuitive sense. I mean, teachers are dealing with classroom management issues. they're creating assessments, they're figuring out the best way to explain with analogies, how to give students feedback, and so on. There's a lot to be getting on with. And so clearly, it makes sense for teachers to focus on one aspect of their profession at a time. In terms of sequencing, there's some of the skills that we've looked at where the sequence is sort of well established. Music is actually a great example where it's understood what sorts of tasks students should take on first. It's less obvious in the case of teaching, but I think with some analysis, we could really think about what is foundational to teaching, what must be in place before you can start working on these other aspects of the skill. And I think if you just look at the data of what early teachers are most concerned about, it's classroom management every time. And that, again, sort of fits well with this idea that if this aspect of the skill isn't in place, it's going to be very hard to gain expertise in the others. The teacher needs to feel confident that they're in control of their classroom and they feel good about what the students are doing. Feedback is another crucial aspect of gaining expertise. And I think frequently teachers are sort of in the position of the student, the piano student here, who like knows something went wrong, but they're not really quite sure what it was. If you talk with teachers, they'll say, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the lesson was going fine until the lesson absolutely was not going fine. And I know something went wrong in between these two photos, but I'm not certain of what it was. So expert on-the-spot feedback is going to be a crucial aspect of teachers gaining the skill of teaching. Generating new strategies, of course, is going to be equally important, and teachers are also going to need some support with that. I'll mention briefly a project called My Teaching Partner, which was actually created here at the University of Virginia and continues to be supported here. I mean, it's this 5-step cycle. You start at the top of the circle up here. What the teacher will do is record their classroom. They'll record themselves teaching a lesson. And then in step 2, they'll send that video to a coach with some expertise. The coach will watch it, and then they'll select sort of a 10-minute, typically, snippet of the video that they think is especially interesting and a learning opportunity for the teacher. And then they'll send that snip back to the teacher along with some prompts and things to think about. The teacher will review the video, think about the prompts. In step 4, they meet online and discuss the video, talk about what the teacher is thinking about that moment of their teaching, and then develop a plan to bring new ideas to the classroom based on their analysis. So I think that puts together a lot of the components that we're talking about here in terms of feedback and generating new strategies. The final element here, expected to take a while, I think is especially important when we're thinking about professional development of teachers. Most of us involved in this know that the most common model is somebody comes in for an afternoon or at most a day, they give a talk about an effective way to teach, and then they disappear. So most of the things that we're describing as being really important for gaining expertise are not in place in that model. So I'm going to close it there, and I hope I've provided some evidence and some food for thought on ways that studies of the basic science of gaining expertise can be useful both in our thinking about students gaining that expertise, but in addition can be useful in thinking about how to help teachers gain expertise.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So next we will hear from Joe Westbrook. Joe is Senior Lecturer in Education and Co-Director of the Center for International Education at the University of Sussex. Her research interests focus on curricula and pedagogies that provide inclusive and equitable learning experiences for disadvantaged students in a range of contexts. Her expertise lies in inclusive pedagogies and in learning to read and comprehend in multilingual classrooms at primary and secondary school. Dr. Westbrook, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Anna, you're in control here with my slides, I think. Okay. Yeah, they're not all showing. Oh, there we go, lovely. Right, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for me in England. I'm very pleased to be talking about the principles of inclusive pedagogies and teacher education programs. So if you go on to the next one, Anna. I am going to have a focus on inclusion as an inclusion of learners with disabilities. But of course, inclusion means literally all. And quite rightly now, we're focusing on those left out through the pandemic. But of course, they've always been left out. Those with disabilities, girls, those in remote rural areas, those who are very poor, those who come to school hungry. But inclusion and exclusion, of course, exist very much side by side, and they conjoined, if you like. So even if we're getting more children into classrooms where contexts are resource constrained, you might have learners in the classroom, but if they're at the back and there are 90 children and they can't see the board, or there's someone who's visually impaired and they don't have the financial resources at home to get a pair of glasses, or they find the classroom very noisy and too distracting, then they're not going to be learning. But inclusion is such a major, has got so much emphasis now, that there are these inadvertent pressures to conform. But of course, it is about thinking about inclusion into what, and inclusion for what purposes. So if we're getting children into mainstream school and they are further excluded because a mass education system has a given curriculum with benchmarks and assessment modes that are premised on whatever the normal child and their development is, then they are going to be excluded. And in this way, sometimes it's helpful to think of inclusion as an ongoing process. And sometimes we might want to think further about integration, and not that inclusion is the be all and the end all. One tutor I was working with in Uganda, who herself was blind, said, listen, we need to have, resource centres on site in mainstream schools where kids go to learn Braille, or where they can just have time out. And this is the dilemma of difference that many of you will be very familiar with, that sense of we need to have education for all, but we need to also within a school, a classroom, an education system, think about, have a focus on learners with disabilities. And actually, if we're brave, we need to prioritise and privilege learners with disabilities, those who are really left behind. And of course, there's a lot of discussion and movement behind that. And that leads us, therefore, to an approach which is not only rights-based, but I think is one on social justice. So I'm getting into the practicalities. Anna, the next one, please. This, my research and everything I'm saying here really draws on 10 years of research, looking primarily at teacher education, how primary school teachers are trained to teach at both secondary, but mostly primary, and more recent work on inclusive pedagogies and curriculum and pedagogies for out of school children in Ethiopia and Liberia. And in a way, with my colleagues, Jackie Shepherd and Susie Miles at University of Manchester in England, we have come up with some ideas. A lot of these are drawn from the practices of very experienced teachers in Tanzania, most of whom had no training in inclusion. But in looking at what they're doing, and indeed their younger colleagues, NQTs, they were doing very interesting things through their own practice, through interaction with the environment and their students, and without any specific intervention. So first of all, what they're able to do was that they could identify the learners in their classroom. They might have had very large classrooms, but they could see and they knew enough, probably not enough, but they knew enough about a particular impairment so that they knew how to adapt around the child's physical, perhaps, impairment, whether they were the level to which they were visually impaired or visually had hearing impairment, the level of the kind of, or perhaps if they had autism, the way in which that manifested itself. So that there was a sense of working around that. And of course, the important thing of having a very safe, welcoming physical learning space. And we know about the importance of getting children to school, of creating, having latrines with washing facilities, of having ramps, of having adapted furniture so that a child on a wheelchair, can get up, can get into the classroom and can sit and feel happy. What was also important are teachers' relationships to parents. I've got students studying who are Zambian and Kenyan, and the importance of the teachers' working relationship with parents and carers, but also local NGOs and faith groups who can come in and support even with just basic things like transport. And very importantly, this came up in Kenya. I'm very aware that contexts differ wildly, region to region, country to country, and within country. But the support of the head teacher, whether they are able to support inclusive education and therefore direct the funds and reach out to, as I said, the community, that is really important. And then you get on to resources. The given curriculum is there. Teachers are under the cosh to get through it. A lot of these experienced teachers in Tanzania were quite critical of the curriculum, and they modified it. And sometimes if they're teaching geometry, rather than teach one shape, this is very young children, here's a square, and the next lesson, here's a rectangle. They said, no, it's too slow. I want to put them all together as introductory lesson. So they're able to modify the curriculum, but they planned. And again, where there were very few resources, they had very equitable ways of sharing the resources, and the small things like using a cream background. That's why I'm trying to model this with my own slides. I'm having very large writing, sharing the board, and bringing in sufficient teaching materials. All these were important and kind of requisites to learning, together with peer learning. But the real eye-opener was what we're calling inclusive pedagogical content knowledge. Anna, the next slide, please. And if you can press a button, we have that's it, lovely. So teaching. Now the Teach observation tool from the World Bank has got teachers, a section on teachers needing to explain content clearly, and that's great. But what we found about these experienced teachers was that they didn't only do that, they explained a concept, but most importantly, they adapted it and they extended it. They extended it so that children with particular impairments or children in a particular group could really understand the concept. And this is how we get children to learn. And they didn't just do it one way or once, but they didn't then just repeat the same thing. And someone else, I think it was Alex at the beginning, they brought in metaphor and they brought in analogy and they used physical objectives, physical objects. Very, very, I'm just looking at the chat, Elizabeth, very low cost, really low cost teaching materials. They use gestures. For example, in teaching geometry, for these introduction to geometry, Rose had a boy who was completely blind in her class, and I think she had about 60 or 70 learners. These were ordinary primary school teachers. And she said, I wanted them to get exactly the concepts I was teaching, especially for the blind, because they could not see what I posted on the blackboard. So they could not see she'd drawn out the shapes of a triangle and a circle, etc. So I looked at items which they could touch and get to know how the shapes on the blackboard looks like. So she said, can we all feel our desk? And she got all the children to feel their desks, and they were rectangular desks. She said, that is the shape. And the boy who was blind was also able to do that. And then she said, now, a circle. Think about the circle. Think about a circle. Think about what you eat on at lunch, your dinner plate. That is a circle. So again, she was explaining and extending these so that all children benefited. It wasn't only for a particular child with an impairment. And it was this that I'm suggesting is as important as everything else, as well as knowing the sticking points. Young children find it very difficult, for example, to learn place value. They never quite know whether it's 11 or 110 or 111. And obviously all children need to talk. So Anna, can you press one more time? Thank you. So assessment, and actually this has come up in the previous ones. This is really important, and perhaps why I'm not so keen personally on scripted lessons, because of seeing a lot of very good teaching, which is relational and responsive. That sense as Edwin needing to say, oh, you need to stop. Are they doing as you are instructing them? Are they able to do it? So that sense of, yes, you need in that moment to check for understanding. One of the teachers said, yes, I look at their faces and see if they get it or not. So it needs time and space. And not all children will. And Sophia said, it often pains me a lot when I find some children fail to understand. So again, inclusion and exclusion, literally minute by minute. If you've got 90 children, or even 30, but you have to get through things, how do you actually make sure that they've all got it? They really understand what a square is, what its characteristics are. So if they don't understand, that's where a scripted lesson has to say stop, and you've got to look, and you have to go in and say, right, they haven't understood, I've got to do it this way. And if it means that you're 2 weeks behind, but children get it, maybe that's all right, but it's easy for me to say. But I have been a teacher in some challenging London schools, so there we go. Right, next one, Anna, please. All right, so I was also asked to talk about some powerful examples of teacher development for inclusion that I know about and I'm involved with. So the first one are speed schools classes or second chance classes in Ethiopia for out of school children who have never been to school or who have dropped out. And of course, I think it's something like 1.2 billion children were out of school, of course, during the global pandemic. But this is still ongoing, and there's a very happy end to this story. It's funded by the Luminos Fund. You can have a look at their website. At Sussex, we were asked to do the evaluation stretching from 2011. But it is a programme where children from 8 to 14 are identified at a very local level by teachers, by Warada, Kabeli, that's village and town offices. And they come in, and over 9 months, they learn the first 3 years of the primary curriculum, the national Ethiopian primary curriculum. So it is accelerated learning. And the key part of it is that it is about children working together and learning from one another. Can I have the next slide, please? So the actual pedagogy is very near to a critical pedagogy, almost coming from the Brazilian Paulo Freire, but it is an indigenous pedagogy. It's put together by Ethiopians for Ethiopian children. It's very intensive. There are 40 weeks a year, 7 lessons of an hour each a day. But in the lesson structure, they have a recap where the teacher hooks children into the learning through highly interactive question and answer. The teachers then present the new content in the way that I've described, very clearly using lots of examples. And then the children themselves are in these fixed stable groups. And one group might be storytelling, another group might be game group, or handicraft, and they stay in these groups, they then talk about what they've learned and they relearn it together, but they also transfigure it by having to present it to the rest of the group. So the children get a repetition of the same concept, but through different artistic designations. If you can go on to the next slide, I'm coming to the end. Teacher training, which I was asked to talk about. Teachers who come on this, you might call them para-teachers. Most of them have got very little education, but they come in and they do a 3-week experiential teacher training carried out by those who really know about the pedagogy. They've been head teachers, and the teachers experience the pedagogy. Of course, this is not that unique. BRAC schools in Bangladesh have started this off, but you can see that the teachers are sat in their groups. There's a real focus on planning because they have to get through the curriculum in 9 months. But there's also, what is hugely important is that they get to understand a socio-cultural understanding of the children, why they've dropped out, you know, what the reasons are. And they come to see the children not as stupid or poor, but as children who are disadvantaged, but highly motivated, knowledgeable, capable and deserving of learning. And that's very powerful. If someone tells you you're clever, you are. And they also see the teacher on the right, he's doing a counting game because it's highly interactive. You know the counting game when you throw stones up and you catch them on the back of your hand and you count? So there's a lot of merriment, a lot of enjoyment on that. If you go on to the next one. Anna?
Joe, we're running over time, okay. So if you could just wrap it up. Thank you very much.
So what you see here with the Speed School pedagogy are the pedagogy in action. You can see the children thinking hard for about 30 seconds in the middle here. You see the children having to talk. You see the accumulation of children's learning on the right. And you also see that teachers are using, they are going around and assessing children's books. There's another one on in Uganda, but I've run out of time. Sorry about that. It's there on the PowerPoint if they're going to be made available to all. I have to stop.
Thank you so very much.
Okay.
And I am sorry for having cut you off. I didn't mean it that way exactly, but I just want to make sure we have a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So next and finally, but as one says, last but not least, we have Professor Pooja Agarwal. Pooja is a cognitive scientist and assistant professor of psychology at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. She teaches psychological science, conducts research on how students learn, and is the author of the book Powerful Teaching, Unleashing the Science of Learning. Professor Agarwal, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone. Thank you for spending this time with us today. And a very big thank you to the World Bank for organizing this whole event and launching this new coach program. Before I get started, I wanted to mention that the slides from my presentation are available online. I've put the link in the chat. It's retrievalpractice.org/world bank. So I have all those slides there. We know from plenty of cognitive science research that we actually can't multitask, we multi-fail. So I'm going to give you about 10 seconds if you'd like to pull up that link. Again, it's retrievalpractice.org/world bank. And so as I refer to resources today, there are the slides as well as more information. So I am Dr. Pooja Agarwal. I'm a cognitive scientist. I've been conducting research on how students learn for about 15 years. I'm also a teacher. I teach college students in Boston, Massachusetts in the United States. So I'll be sharing a little bit of that research and some practical teaching strategies with you today. I'd like to start actually with a very random trivia fact, and I'm going to ask you to put your best guess in the chat. So get ready to make a guess in the chat. I will make that in a second. How many bones are in the adult human body? Go ahead and type in your best guess into the chat. I'm not grading you. There is no need to cheat. I see everything from 110 to 40. I see 1,000, 272, 97, 206, and 100, 232. So the answer is 206, 206, 206. And the reason I ask this question is because when it comes to learning in classrooms, whether it's trivia facts or complex information, we are often thinking about getting information into students' heads. So I could have just told you the number of bones, but instead I wanted you to pull that information out of your head. So from more than 100 years of cognitive science research, we often think of learning as getting information into our students' heads. We lecture, they read the textbook, but a large component of learning is what we call retrieval. To bring this information to mind, maybe you mentally traveled back to high school or elementary school. There are a number of principles I call power tools based on cognitive science that help students learn. I'm only going to focus on the first one. I have more information on my website about the other ones listed here. In terms of the first one, retrieval practice, it's bringing information to mind. So you could think about the book you most recently read or the movie you watched most recently, what happened in that movie. I, for example, my birthday is coming up soon. And so I'm thinking about what I did on my birthday last year. I went skydiving, which is pretty exciting. Bringing that information to mind is retrieval practice. Or another example is when you're learning your students' names, the second time you see them, trying to mentally remember what their name is another form of retrieval practice. There's been more than 100 years of research. Of course, I don't have time to go through all of that. I'll talk very briefly about research today. We know from that research that retrieval practice transforms students' long-term learning. So not just learning in the short term that many of the presenters mentioned today, but how can we help students remember beyond our classroom? How can I help my college students remember beyond the 15 weeks we spend in the semester together? This retrieval practice can take a lot of different forms. I'll give you a few examples, but that could include quizzes and flashcards. Again, just retrieving, mentally bringing that information forward. In terms of research, there's been a lot of laboratory research. I'm personally very excited that my colleagues and I conducted more than 10 years of research in classroom settings from grade 6 through grade 12. And what we found over that 10 years is that we were able to raise students' grades from a C to an A level just with retrieval practice. In this context, students were going through little mini quizzes and answering multiple choice questions. Now, one question or concern about this bringing information to mind is it sounds like rote memorization, like asking the number of bones in the human body. And lots of research has demonstrated that this act of retrieval improves complex higher order learning. It improves engineering learning in college students. It improves even how medical students diagnose neurology. Now, this may seem intuitive, and it is. It's not a new strategy. It's simply bringing information to mind again. But I'm going to show you some research-based strategies for how you can adopt this in your school or classroom. Briefly, my colleagues and I just completed a large review of the literature. I have more information linked on my website. Just very briefly, some key findings we had is that the majority of experiments, this was restricted to classroom studies specifically, not laboratory studies. The majority demonstrated medium or large effects of retrieval practice. Interestingly, only 3 experiments of the ones we identified were conducted in non-weird countries, meaning countries outside of the United States and Western Europe. So those 3 countries included research from Taiwan, Turkey, and Pakistan. So there's a rich area for anyone interested in conducting retrieval practice research in your country. There are some holes in the literature. We need more research on how retrieval practice improves student learning from pop quizzes, for example, from humanities, the language arts. And we found that across the board, our review of the literature included students from elementary school through graduate school and medical school. It didn't really matter in terms of when the retrieval practice was timed, how often it happened, if feedback was provided immediately or delayed. Across such a wide range of 50 experiments, retrieval practice consistently benefited student learning. So in terms of what this means in the classroom, I am so excited that there is evidence supporting this retrieval and ways we can use it in our classrooms without additional preparation and without grading at all. None of us have ever wanted to spend more time grading, I assume. So just to put it in context, here are some of the college students I teach at the Berklee College of Music in the United States in Boston. I have students from all over the world. About 30 to 40% of my students are international, non-US students who are also English language learners. So I love to see that these retrieval practice strategies I'll share with you benefit students from around the world. I also was able to adapt these strategies during the pandemic when we were learning on Zoom. Whether it was through the chat feature, I used a lot of Google Forms and Google Slides as well. Here's one of the simplest ways you can encourage retrieval practice in your classroom. So often we start our class by saying, all right, students, here's what we did in class last week. That's what we call encoding, getting information into our heads or into our students' heads, presenting them information. A simple switch, no preparation, no grading, is to just ask students, what did we learn in class last week? That's retrieval practice, to give students a moment to think back, to mentally struggle. We know that struggle is a good thing for learning, is just that switch from reviewing to retrieving for students. Another example research demonstrates improves students' long-term learning is what's called a brain dump. In the scientific literature, we call it free recall, and it's simply asking students to write down everything they can remember about a topic. Write down everything you remember about ancient Egypt, or write down everything you remember about developmental and child psychology. Any topic you like, you could give students a few minutes. You don't have to grade this. You don't even have to collect it. It's that idea, that strategy, the focus on retrieving. A more specific example is to simply ask students to retrieve 2 things, or it could be 3 things or 4 things, but what are just 2 things you remember from the lesson last week? This is highly adaptable for content areas, ages of students. It's very flexible. And you could ask students to retrieve these 2 things at the end of a lecture. They could do this at home when they're reading from their textbook, at the end of the day, at the end of the week. And it really doesn't take extra classroom time. I know that I only have so much time when I teach. We have content we want to cover. How do we balance that? And I strongly suggest something as simple as asking students 2 things doesn't take extra classroom time, doesn't take preparation, doesn't take grading, and it's based on more than 100 years of research. A few things I wanted to mention very briefly is that you could also provide mini quizzes or 2 things as soon as students walk into a classroom or as they're leaving, so entry or exit tickets. We know from lots of research and experience, there are tons of tech tools out there to use. We know that retrieval practice, whether it's written or typed, is beneficial. Multiple choice and short answer questions both improve learning. And again, there's not much optimal timing. So what works for you and your classroom and your school is going to benefit students when you focus on retrieving. One more strategy I wanted to share is what I call retrieve taking. So it's a play on note taking. One thing I love about this is we can model this for students as teachers. They can do this at home when they're studying. And if you're a parent, you can share this with your child as well. So how retrieve taking works is you teach a lesson or students are reading their book, but they are not taking notes simultaneously. They're just reading or just paying attention to the lesson. Then you pause the lesson or students close their book. Then they retrieve their notes. What are two things from the chapter I just read that I want to remember? What are two things from that lesson or one thing that the teacher just said? And then to continue with the lesson or reading. So instead of simultaneously taking notes while trying to pay attention to a lesson, I bet some of you are taking notes right now, is to just pay attention, give students that time to pause, retrieve their notes, and then move on. So I'd like to take a second in the chat is to think about, you have spent an hour with us today already. Type into the chat, what is one thing you want to remember from this hour of presentations? We've had 4 presenters. What is something that stuck out to you? Anything you want to retrieve so that you have spent this hour with us, but you get beyond that one and done. So type into the chat, what's something you want to remember? I encourage you while you're thinking about that, don't look at your notes, don't look at my slides, just type in something you want to remember. I see the mention of being present, inclusive learning, retrieval practice in general, 2 points or 2 things, multi-pronged intervention. See, there's so much we can remember, and we all have different interests in what we want to remember as well. So really be mindful, our students can use this, we can use this as teachers, but we can use this for ourselves as we're going through more teacher professional development. So as you join us for more coach programs, make sure you're engaging in all of this exciting retrieval practice and sharing with each other. So in that way, I'll just mention some resources. Again, I have this website, retrievalpractice.org. The slides are directly available at retrievalpractice.org/World Bank. I have a number of translations on my website. So I have free downloads and I have them in English, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and Mandarin. So for all over the world, please download free resources and share them. I've got recommended books on the science of learning, recommended podcasts on my website. I want to make this easy for you to implement and share the science of learning. So lastly, if you could type into the chat, how many bones are in the adult human body? It's a little bit more when we're children. Pretty much all of us who are here on this Zoom have the same number of bones in our body. And that's retrieval practice. So if you remember the number of bones, I hope you will remember something from your time with us today. And it is 2:06. So thank you so much for your attention and your time. And I'll turn it back over to our moderator for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a truly fantastic presentation and very entertaining to boot. So what you wanted was for all of us to pay attention and be able to retrieve some of the material. I'm sure you've accomplished that much. So look, there have been a lot of very interesting questions in the chat, and I'm going to do my best. We have about 20 minutes to have a little conversation about some of these topics, and I'm going to do my best to try to pull out some common topics and give the different speakers a chance to intervene on this. And one clearly is the question of scripted lessons versus sort of a more personalized approach. Personally, I've been supportive or perhaps open to the idea of having scripted lessons that actually give very little room for personalization, in some contexts at least, because teacher content knowledge in a lot of the settings where we're talking is very, very limited. Classrooms are very large. We can talk about 70, 80 kids in a classroom. Classroom management, as we've discussed, may be a challenge. So I guess my question to all of the speakers is, coming at it from your own expertise, from your own research and other research that you're aware of, what is the take on, in very low income settings in particular, and very low capacity settings very often, what is your take on this? And sort of somewhat tied to that, Daniel Winningham talked about the commonalities in learning, but that would seem to be encouraging in some sense, because it seems to suggest that a lot of what we can do, if we pick out carefully what it is that we do, will work for, if not all kids, the vast majority of kids. But then Joe Westbrook's presentation was sort of came at it from a different angle. And so my question is just, maybe we can have a little bit of a round, and I don't really care what order, perhaps we can go backwards this time. So we go in a reverse order, and just your thoughts on this, and in particular, like I said, in the context of low income, low capacity settings. I too have been was a teacher for a few years after I graduated from undergrad, and then these are real challenges. It seems to me, trying to teach a class that really, in that kind of setting, is responsive, is able to provide feedback to individual students that actually helps their learning, seems to me very challenging, but I may just be wrong about that. So why don't we start with Dr. Agarwal, please?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I've taught in low-income settings, and there is some research on retrieval practice in low-income settings. I would love to collaborate and see more. And from my own experience, because we do need more research, something like that brain dump, writing down everything you know, just takes a pencil and a piece of paper. It doesn't require fancy technology. It doesn't require internet or a computer or fancy tech apps. It is so low tech. And again, I love that there's research to support that it improves student learning. So for me, with that strategy and other ones on my website and in my book, we talk about how to adapt this also for all students, students with disabilities, again, English language learners as well. So I hope that's helpful, is that the strategies I've spent a lot of time on adapt very well to low income settings.
Thank you. Why don't we go to Professor Westbrook?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the Ben Piper's work is actually critiquing very tightly scripted lessons, and is talking about far more structured. And if that provides a template or a model for teachers just beginning, then that might be helpful. Certainly, the work that I've been involved with, as I said, in mostly in East, but also West Africa, there's no use of scripted lessons, because in all of those, the idea is that teachers have to do the thinking. I think someone in the chat talked about, the creative thinking. And I think what we were trying to say is that, that you need a secure knowledge base, but you've got to think, okay, how am I really going to explain, what 3 + 3 is? I know it's basic, but, for children who are just trying to learn, it is that sense of being able to adapt it, and especially for learners with disabilities, then language and alternative communication strategies are absolutely key. So I'm obviously a little hesitant about it, apart from an initial model as a starting point.
Dr. Shea, you're muted. I wonder if you were calling on me, though.
I was, and I was encouraging you to share your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think as a research question, it's extraordinarily difficult to answer, because the question is what's the counterfactual? So you're comparing scripted lessons to what? Unscripted lessons, presumably. And there's going to be enormous variability in unscripted lessons. So I think it's the kind of research question that is enormously difficult to research. I think another very important factor is how teachers view the profession of teaching in the particular context you find yourself. So in the US, throughout the US, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about high income or low income communities, there's enormous resistance to scripted lessons because teachers feel that that is not what teaching is about. And so even in circumstances where there have been early reading programs, for example, that are tightly scripted, but have been shown to be enormously successful in very similar circumstances, most teachers really don't like the idea because they feel like it is sort of insulting to their autonomy. Whereas in other contexts, teachers wouldn't have that impression at all. They still see a great deal of professionalism, even if they're handed a script. So I think hoping for a research-based answer to this, I think, is something that we may be waiting for a while if we're looking for something very general. And again, I think thinking about the context is also very important.
So Alex, why don't you go ahead and give us your thoughts, since I think it started with you here, so maybe fitting to let you intervene here.
I'll take full blame for it. I just actually want to underscore what Drs. Agarwal, Westbrook, and Willingham said, that it really depends entirely on the context. And I also think that there's a bit of an abuse of terms here where we call it scripted lessons, and I think it conjures this idea that there's some script that's it. And at least in our context, and I think in the context where scripted lessons have performed the best, it's much more just a very clear roadmap. It's like having a Google Maps or a MapQuest where, okay, you're going to turn right here and you'll go for 1.2 miles and you're going to turn left here. And of course, if there's something in the road, you have to take another route. And so, this is much more, I think, at least from our perspective, which again, I think is, as Dr. Williams said, perhaps more appropriate for greater direction because the skills are so well known, and it's much easier, I think, to design a script for teaching literacy or two-digit subtraction with borrowing than it is for creative writing or for solving linear analysis problems. And so I think that general notion of scripted lessons is one that we should think about as sort of empowering teachers to do it right, but also one that, as was alluded to, it works better in some contexts. I think particularly the ones that I spoke about earlier, and perhaps less well in others, as the skills being taught get more complicated.
So let me follow up a little bit on this, because again, if you have a classroom of 90 kids who you see for, let's say, 7 months a year, and you see them 7 months a year, and we know in many of these countries, the teacher doesn't even show up 30% of the time. So you see these kids, whatever that works out to be, 7 months, whatever, 20 days, 140, you see them 100 days. Basically, you see these kids, you see 90 kids for 100 days. And it may even be that in many contexts, if there are multiple teachers teaching, once you get into high school, so you see them for 100 hours, you see 100 kids for 100 hours, roughly. How feasible is it really to give personalized instruction? Other than identifying, for example, some kids who are really struggling, and it's obvious that they're really struggling, and some kids who are clearly ahead of the material. I just wonder, how realistic is this, not in a small research setting, but with the teachers that we have, the teachers and the kids, that come to these classrooms and the resources that are available. So again, maybe some thought to that in the context that very often we are working. And I think part of what happens very often is teachers favor then. We've done a lot of research on this as well, video filming teachers for many days and see and that's, I think, part of the reason they favor standing in front of the classroom and sort of lecturing is, in some sense, they can keep control of what's going on, and they can make sure, however effectively or not, to deliver a body of knowledge, if you want, and so I just want a little bit of thought about that for everyone. Why don't we start with Professor Willingham on this one, just to mix things up a little bit.
Sure, because you set such an easy problem, right? 100 kids, how are you going to differentiate instruction? No, I think I agree with what's implicit in your question, that the thought of individualized instruction, given very limited resources, enormous number of kids, and the circumstances you described would be extremely challenging. I think the closest you could come is imagining within one classroom having a couple of different tracks where kids are spending some of their time working independently, so that the kids who really are sort of zooming ahead and feel very confident with the main body of the lesson have a chance to get further enriched instruction. And then there's perhaps some time to work with the kids who are really struggling. Beyond that, yeah, I mean, I think given the circumstances that you described, anything more individualized would, I can't see how that might happen.
So why don't we give Professor Westbrook to jump in here?
Save us, Joe.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the classes I've seen and researched, and particularly in Uganda, where you've got large classes, I think I was trying to say that there are these prerequisites, even in very large classrooms, teachers, and I want to keep a very positive view of teachers because they're all we have, can, if they prioritize those learners who have impairments, who need to be in a particular place, that is possible and that is done. So you see teachers saying, right, you need to sit at the front, so that those who most need it get that learning. And so, and if you have an interpreter, not always the case, but that works. And then organizing in groups. I saw this in Western Uganda. So you get teachers who, two tracks. So you kind of, I don't like ability grouping personally, but you have a sense of there's a group of learners, and you might actually group them in one way, and say if they're reading, they will all read aloud as a group, and the teacher can move up and down. So that there are these, there are possibilities here. And of course, students do appreciate what one of my PhD students called good teacher flow. A teacher who can really explain things, and often without notes, and use really, really detailed, good, clear blackboard figures. And with the adaptation that I was talking about, that they do it in different ways, they come in different ways, that can really, really help. It's when teachers explain something and if kids don't get it and then they move on, that is very difficult. That is exclusion, whoever is excluded. So that's possible.
I guess in some sense, this is why a number of researchers, economists, have come out in favor, actually, of ability grouping. So Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and others, Nobel Prize winners, have done research on exactly this, because otherwise what ends up happening with a very diverse group of students, what ends up happening is, in general, teachers teach to the top, and which is completely irrelevant, and all the students from the middle downward get left completely behind. But that's just my way of a footnote. Alex, do you have any comments, thoughts about this?
Yeah, very briefly, I think, I just want to echo what you said, that I think the general pattern is that pedagogy that is targeted at the right level seems to be much more effective than pedagogy which is, targeted at sort of the mean, or the 75th percentile, the 90th percentile, or the 25th percentile. I think, one of the other stylized facts is that if someone performs very well and they get put in a class where the level of sort of ability entering is lower than what they are, they'll also sort of regress to that mean. And so I think there's lots of ways to fix the problem that you posed at the beginning of, 100 kids, 100 hours, how do you do it? And I think sort of setting up an infrastructure where, if you have tablets, the MindSpark stuff that Kartik Muralidharan, Abhijit Singh, and Ale Ganamian tested in that AER paper. But also, what we do is just workbooks that have varying levels of difficulty. And the teacher can say, okay, the students who are at this level, go to page 75. And the students who are at this level, go to page 25. And I think, you don't necessarily need a tablet in every student's hand to be able to give students the ability to find problems and exercises that are going to be the most helpful for them. But I think there are questions of equity that are sort of separate from this. And I think it's important to separate the sort of efficiency equity side of things.
Professor Agarwal, do you have any reflections on this as well?
I have my teacher brain on right now. I just finished teaching my 100 students yesterday. And at least in terms of providing kind of this personalized learning, or being more aware of students at the top who are getting a lot of attention or not, and then students who are struggling, who are getting a lot of attention or not. One of the simplest strategies I use is my retrieval practices or my mini quizzes I use Google Forms right now, and I simply have an open-ended question where I just literally ask students, how are you? And that's all the question is just, how are you? And I would say the majority of my students type in how they're doing, whether they are struggling with being back in person or having some family or friend situations, or many of them are doing well. And I share how I'm doing as well. And it's just nice in that way because across all of my students, I have a sense of how they're doing. Many of them write about how they're doing in my class as well. And I just find that that actually is a nice way to reach all students so that I know which students need additional supports, which students are doing well, which students I have concerns about. Now, as many of you mentioned, it's hard to really be in touch with all of our students. But I do find, at least if there are ways I can touch base with all of them, that can be helpful. So that's just one strategy I use.
Thank you so much. We only have a few minutes and there's so many different things we could talk about, but I just want to raise one other question. And that's in general, the studies that you are presenting and that most of us have worked on are sort of either proof of concept studies or pilots, and then the question is, whenever I discuss this with policymakers, they say, yeah, that's great. That works for 100 teachers, maybe it even works for 500 teachers. And then you go to a country like Peru and they say, but what do we do like with 200,000 teachers? And how realistic is it to do some of these things, with 200,000 teachers? And what can we learn from these proof of concepts to these pilots to these at-scale interventions? And I think that's a general question that we really, as researchers, myself included, need to reflect carefully about. I mean, just for example, in my own research, we found that an intervention, this is a parenting intervention, which in Jamaica showed itself to be extremely promising, but the sample size was 70 kids. The sample size of treated kids was 70 kids. And when we took this to Peru in this case, we rolled out this intervention, and within 2 years, 70,000 kids were being treated by with a program like that. And of course, we found, or maybe not of course, what we found is that the effectiveness of the intervention is about 10%, 15% of the intervention in Jamaica, even though it was actually designed and overseen by the same researchers who'd done the intervention in Jamaica. But I guess more generally, I mean, maybe a couple of words of reflection before we all log out on how you see your roles as researchers sort of on this quandary between these very carefully designed, monitored, academically rigorous research, and then sort of the messy reality of rolling out anything like this at scale, even leaving aside 90 kids per classroom, but just the messy reality of dealing with a government that's trying their best to implement something maybe, and how that all works out. So why don't we start? I'm just going to sort of come up with a random order, but why don't we start with Alex this time?
So I think there are two very broad thoughts I have, and I'll be brief. I think one is a little bit like the discussion we had about scripted lessons. The lessons that come out of our work, I think, should be guideposts. And of course, the reality is messy. And I think it's sort of I like find fault with the premise that the researcher is going to find the exact script that's going to work for anyone. And so I think that's my first point. My second point is conditional on that constraint. It is still crucial and incumbent upon us for thinking about where things might break. And I think that is something that we don't do a lot of work on, but I think about it like the way I teach microeconomics, right? You teach like the most basic utility maximization framework, and then you tell everyone why it's wrong. And you tear it down and you build it back up with perhaps imperfect information or something else. And so I think the way that I think about the next step, for example, in our work and the scripted lessons is, okay, let's talk about exactly why that won't work and try to build something based on that foundation.
Professor Willingham,
Give us your thoughts on this,
sure, very briefly.
And pilots and so on.
Yes, I'm glad you brought it up, and it's obviously an enormous problem. And the thing I would say we should pay most attention to is look for multiple sources of evidence at multiple levels of analysis as a way of increasing our confidence. So when you look at an intervention of the sort that Alex described, you're also looking at more fine-grained laboratory work that might support reasons that you would think that this intervention, the components of this intervention are going to be successful. And the other way of thinking about it is the research that Pooja described has shown itself to be extremely robust to changes in context. So I sort of think along two dimensions. The first one I described is sort of a vertical dimension where you're looking at different levels of analysis of the intervention and looking for some reason to be confident that there's good research at each of those levels. And then the research that Pooja described is sort of the horizontal dimension where there's already been research in a number of different contexts that gives us reason to think that it's going to extend into new contexts.
Thanks, Professor Westbrook.
Thanks. Well, I didn't give the happy ending to the speed schools. The research that Sussex undertook was very mixed methods. It was longitudinal, tracking a large number of students who had graduated into the mainstream classrooms over time, as well as a very close curriculum and pedagogic review. And that was presented to the government of Ethiopia, who themselves are very keen and have built into their whole system an alternative approach for children with who have dropped out. So that the quality of that research done with researchers from the University of Hawassa in this case, persuaded the government they have now adopted it. So that it's been delayed because of the global pandemic, but there's government adoption, which is being scaled out. So that's going to be scaled up to four areas, but on a massive scale. And we're doing a process evaluation of that, seeing how that's done. Both at, again, my area, which is looking at the intricacies of pedagogy and inclusion, but also systems level and the financing. So that to me it's slow, but with government absolutely at the center of it, which I know somebody talked about the Sobral in Brazil was very similar. So, you know, obviously we don't know how that works such a scale, but it's so far highly interesting and working, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you. I'll just add to say that I love messy research and doing this research in schools is incredibly messy between my tenures in schools and then this review of the literature. And I love messy research as a very rigorous test of that basic laboratory research to see if it works in the real world. From my perspective, what we need more is more messy research, which takes a lot of resources and time and staff and money. So I feel that we need to start thinking about how we can invest in a literal and a figurative sense in making sure we are continuing to do more of that messy research. In that way, we know what it means to scale up. Before we start scaling up interventions that may or may not work, we need more of that messy research.
Great. So thank you very much to all of you. There are a ton of other questions in the chat. I think some of the individual researchers, some of our panelists will be able to answer some of those afterwards or online, or you can email them directly. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. I did my best to pull out a couple of questions that sort of took from a lot of different questions rather than actually go through individual questions, because we'd never go through that. But I feel like it's been a really enlightening discussion, a really sort of lively discussion. And I think at the end, it'll help us think through some of these challenges to how to improve teaching practices and professional development in developing countries. So thank you very much, and everybody have a good day.